Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about myself, followed by a bit about what this talk will cover, and then I'll get straight into it. So, who am I? Well, I've been a tech writer for coming up on 4 years now, and during that time I've worked at 3 different tech companies. My current company is called Improbable, which is a startup in London, and we work on a product called Spatial OS, which is aimed at helping games developers to create bigger and more persistent online worlds. And in my time as a tech writer, I've written all kinds of documentation, long-form docs, API docs, user interface text, error messages, and, of course, release notes. So what's this talk going to cover? I'll start by talking a bit about what release notes are and my experience of them. Why I ended up writing a style guide for my company to help me and the other tech writers and also the developers. And then I'll go into a bit about what the style guide covers, and hopefully there'll be some stuff that you can take away and maybe use in your own company. So, firstly, what are release notes? Well, when I looked up on Google, of course, I was surprised to discover that there wasn't really a definitive answer to this question. And by that, I mean Wikipedia. It didn't cite any sources. That means it's someone's opinion. It's various people's opinion. So I thought I would give you my personal perspective on what release notes are in my experience. So basically a list of bullet points alongside a software release to tell users what has changed. They're often split into bug fixes, new features, and known issues. They're not particularly glamorous. I don't think anyone goes into work thinking, today's going to be the release note day, I'm going to put my all into writing release notes. But they are, I think we'd all agree, they are necessary. And in my experience, they're often a bit of an afterthought. They're pulled together frantically at the last minute. You finished everything else for the release. We need to write the release notes. So in case anyone's unfamiliar with what release notes look like, I've taken the liberty of making up a few examples. So, fixes. Fixed something which would probably be quite annoying if it kept happening to you. Features. Added something that maybe you've wanted for quite a while, or maybe you even requested. Known issues. So a warning about something which is also quite annoying, but maybe doesn't happen quite frequently enough for the company to have fixed it yet, or possibly they don't know how to fix it yet, but they will do at some point. And as you can probably tell, my impression of release notes was they're necessary, they're not my favorite thing, but I kind of saw the humor in them sometimes just because of the types of bugs that were coming up. And I can't remember exactly how it happened, but in my first job as a tech writer, I decided it would be fun to see if I could translate some release notes into haiku format. That is 17 syllables in the format 5-7-5. And I knew I wouldn't be able to get all of the technical details into this, such a small space, so I would have to try to capture the essence. So here are a few that I came up with. SRP 1073, perfectly normal action, no longer causes everything to break. These are all real, by the way. These are all directly translated from a release note that I'd written. Finally added a feature you requested 7 years ago. I think it might have been 6 in the real one, but 7, 2 syllables. And the behavior is no longer the opposite of what you'd expect. And I'm judging by the reaction and also the reactions of people I'd shown these to that you can kind of relate to some of these issues. I made around 10 of these in total, and at the risk of sounding even more nerdy, I should clarify that I didn't do this during work time. So, believe it or not, this exercise taught me some valuable things about release notes, which I didn't necessarily realize at the time, but which I then went on to use in my style guide. And that is, when you strip away the technical details, you can spot the patterns. And you'll have noticed that in those examples, there were no details at all. They were very generic. but they seem to capture the essence quite well. And this is something I'll come back to because it's one of the sort of foundations for the style guide that I went on to write, which is that release notes are fairly repetitive. Now, despite the fun that I had translating release notes into haiku format, during my interview for my second tech writing job, I was asked, what don't you enjoy about your current role? And you can probably see what's coming. It didn't take me very long to say release notes. Like, why? Well, they tend to involve a lot of context switching. So release notes cover the whole product, maybe not just the bit that you're focusing on. A lot of research as well. So sometimes I'd have to go into bits that I wasn't really familiar with. So quite a lot of work for not very much. You also don't have much space to work with. No one wants to read paragraphs and paragraphs in release notes, so you've got to have just short bullet points, but you have to give enough context, so there's a tricky balance there. And generally they just weren't quite as fun as the other stuff that I was working on. And my attitude remained fairly like this pretty much until my third job, which is my current role at Improbable. Now, Improbable is definitely the most technical place that I've worked. The product is very, very complicated, and it's, yeah, really, really technical subject matter. And in true startup fashion, developers were writing the release notes. This was fantastic. Like, they were best placed, you know, they were the subject matter experts. They were doing this thing that I found quite onerous and quite tricky. But it soon became clear when they were sending them to me for review that they didn't find them easy to write either. And consequently, the release notes weren't particularly user-friendly. So while the developers knew exactly what they were talking about, they didn't necessarily know what the users needed to know, how to convey that in the best way to the users. So, you know, it was kind of a double-edged sword. Like, it was brilliant that they were writing them, but also I realized I needed to do a lot of work to kind of try and make them more user-focused. And another sort of bugbear of mine was all the bugs started with fixed a bug where, and then description of the bug. And I'll come back to that as well. So I'll run through 3 examples of release notes that came to me from developers and that I tried to improve, and how I went about that, and why this sort of prompted me to write a style guide. So sometimes I'd get a release note that didn't make sense, and I would kind of look at it and think, like, I know this doesn't make sense. I don't know what it's meant to mean, so I can't help here. So I need to go back to the developer and say, you know, can you clarify this? And obviously I can't just say, can you make it clearer, you know? So I thought, how can I get them to make it so I can understand, so I can then help? So I hit upon the idea of asking them to write it in the format, previously when you did X, Y happened. Now when you do X, Z happens. So making it longer, but hopefully making it clearer. So expanding the release note out. And they came back to me with a much longer version, which I actually understood, at least enough to help. So obviously this is quite a lengthy release note to give to users, but at least I felt like I was in a position to work with it and make it a bit shorter. So I then tried to simplify it back down. And what I came up with a release note that was shorter than the really long one, a bit longer than the original, but hopefully it captures the essence. And I know I don't expect everyone to follow this completely. It's quite specific, and it's obviously out of context. But yeah, just kind of to demonstrate the way that I tried to help the developer to expand the release note out before I was able to simplify it down. So another type of release note that I would get quite frequently would be a very formal, sort of official sounding one. And I've noticed that quite often with people who don't write very often. They'll think, okay, it's in writing, it's got to be official, it's got to be, you know, and they'll talk kind of quite in the abstract. So it is now possible to do these things, it is not necessary to do these other things. It's true, like it's got the information there, but it's not super clear for the user, like if they do the things or if someone else, the things happen automatically. So what I wanted to do for this one was to try and make it more direct and talk to the user directly. So my edit for this one was, instead of "it is now possible," which is quite an abstract phrase, "you can now do these, you no longer need to do these other things." And that's quite a simple thing that you can, if you're reviewing a release note, you can kind of prompt people to think, how do I change this from an abstract idea to something that is directly relevant to the user? And the final type that I want to talk about is the stand-up update or commit message style release note. And this is where the developer sort of fell into the trap of basically telling me what they changed in the code, which again is true. They had indeed added these fields. What that meant for the user was unclear. So, it would be perfectly fine in a stand-up to say, this is what I've done, this is what I did yesterday, or in a commit message, but the user has to do a bit of work to figure out why they should care about this. So for this example, again, I tried to make it more user-focused and really spell out what this meant for the user. So you can now see how many users are connected to a deployment, and that's A, and the user capacity of the deployment, B, using D. So just really spell it out. Don't make the user work to untangle the release note. So after reviewing quite a lot of this kind of release note, I realized I was using similar techniques quite frequently. So I thought, is there a standard style that I'm missing? And of course, I Googled this again. I really wanted to find out whether it was normal and intentional to say, fixed an issue where ... That was one of my key concerns. So I turned to Google, and I was surprised to find that there wasn't really any guidance on this. All I found was that a lot of places telling me how to write funny, quirky, kind of friendly release notes, which seem to be quite fashionable at the moment, if you can say release notes are fashionable. But anyway, so for example, you'd find some like this. So we've been giving a little feature you know and love, some TLC behind the scenes to tidy it up and make it easier to find. We'll let you know in-app once it's ready for the main stage. And another brief example, unread badges, which had been being a little inconsistent, have been given a stern talking to and promise to be more reliable henceforth. And I did find these amusing, I have to be honest, but my kind of instinct was that they wouldn't be appropriate for my company, and I didn't really feel like they were necessarily appropriate as release notes, and I wanted to pin down exactly why I felt this, because I didn't want to put it down to just me being a killjoy. So I've tried to analyze this. They're really wordy. The first one, in fact, like the main messages are obscured. The first one doesn't actually have a message. It's basically saying, we've done a thing, and we'll tell you when it's actually done. I mean, it's kind of amusing, but it's you do read it and think, what am I actually taking from this? Yeah, and it just makes more work for the reader to figure out what's going on. And call me boring, but I think the main purpose of release notes is to inform you about what's changed. So secondly, they use humor and idioms and slang, and I think this is likely to divide opinion. And in fact, I did actually find a forum post for one of these companies where some people were saying, oh, these release notes are incredible, this is the only reason I go and read them, I just look for the jokes. And then other people were saying, I wish they would stop with all the self-indulgent in-jokes and just fix some bugs. So it's a risk, you kind of alienate some people while making others, absolutely love you. A more serious reason, I think this can be really confusing for people who are less proficient at English, because you can misinterpret humor. It doesn't cross cultural boundaries that well, and also idioms and slang are quite tricky. Using a lot of metaphor is quite tricky as well. And essentially, I feel that you shouldn't create any extra barriers to understanding. So if you've got a really technical product already, It's probably hard enough to get the ideas from the release notes just on their own without there being extra barriers to understanding. And finally, and this is a very opinionated one, so they wouldn't reflect our voice. They might be fine for certain companies which try to cultivate a sort of friendly personality, and they know their user base very well. It's got a certain demographic maybe. But I couldn't help feeling that it would be a bit strange if we started suddenly writing like this. Our customers would think, it would be a bit of a disconnect for the people that we sell to. So given that I hadn't found what I wanted online, I thought I'd better try and get some basic principles together for a style guide. And I started by thinking of what are release notes, what should they conform to? So a key thing, I think, release notes should be accurate, clear, and concise, and the order of that is very important. There's no point having a really nice, concise release note if it doesn't make sense. As you saw in the first example, it was shorter than my final edit, but it didn't actually make sense. Release notes should be user-focused. So it's all very well saying exactly what you've changed, but it's really good to tell users explicitly how this affects them, why they should care. And similar to that, you need to give enough context. If you've got a save button that has a bug, you can't just say there's a bug with a save button if there are lots of different places where you might use that button and it only happens in certain circumstances. You need to be really clear about who the bug will affect. Next, I tried to explain what you don't necessarily need to do, that you might feel you need to do for release notes. So coming back to it, you don't need to start bug fixes with fixed. If you've organized your release notes sensibly, they should be under a heading that says fixes. And it's often quite convoluted to say fixed a bug where and then try and explain the bug. And also it focuses on what the bug was rather than what you've done to solve it. You don't need to be overly formal and impersonal. So obviously this will depend a bit on your company's voice and your personality of your company, but I feel it's really handy to be able to say, you can do this, you don't need to do this, we fixed this. And having said that you should give enough context, you don't need to go into great detail. There might be something really complex that you're putting a release note for, and that's where the docs come in. You can link out. The release note just needs to have enough information that the correct users will know to go read the docs about that. So next I went on to some writing tips and tricks. Because remember, I was writing this for tech writers, but also for developers. So the first one that I came up with was expand and simplify. And I hit on the idea that this was a bit like when you're solving an equation in maths. You don't look at it and just expect everything to just resolve into the answer before your eyes. You expand the brackets, everything gets a bit more messy, or when you're tidying your house as well, you kind of have to make more mess before you can get everything in its right place. So don't be afraid of writing it out really long before condensing it down. Similar to that, imagine you're explaining it to someone. What do they care about? So if you were saying, I've added this feature, what would they ask you? They'd say, well, why would I want to use this? What's in it for me? And finally, use a template. So templates, I think, are fantastic because they mean less brain work for you as a writer and also less brain work for your readers because that they mean that the release notes are going to be more consistent, they're going to be in a familiar format. So then I had to go think about some templates that you could use. And there's nothing super groundbreaking here. It's just sort of some things to fall back on if you're wondering how to structure a release note. So the first one, really, really simple. You can now, ... So you can use this for a bug fix or for a feature. So the example here, I guess, could be either. If it's a bug fix, this avoids you saying fixed an issue where X, Y, and Z. And if it's a feature, it really forces you to say what you can now do as a user, rather than just talking in the abstract about what you fixed, sorry, what you've added to the code. So the second one, a little bit more complicated. X now or no longer does Y when Z. So for this one, I think now and no longer are really good sort of anchor words to help you focus on what the situation is presently rather than what it was in the past. And the bit at the end, when Z, that's kind of there to make you focus on the context. So does this only happen in certain circumstances, or is it universal to the whole product? And thirdly, and final template, similar to the previous one, X now or no longer does Y, and this means you, as a user, no longer or now need to do Z. So this one is useful where the user needs to update their workflow. So they need to do something extra, because maybe there's a known issue, or they no longer need to do something. Great. So for example, here, we're saying that this SDK now automatically does something, which means that you as a user don't need to do it manually anymore, which is really important for them to know. Don't leave the user to deduce that from the first part. So a key thing to remember here is that these are all just guidelines. They're not rules. And if you've written release notes and you've kind of religiously followed these and your release note sounds quite strange, change it. The guidelines are there to help rather than to restrict. So you just need to use them in the best way for you. And the key takeaway for this, I think, to sum up, is that a style guide should be able to make it easier for those who are writing the release notes, but also for those reading them. And I hope that I've shown with just a few basic principles and with some tips and tricks for how to write release notes and some templates, you can create your own style guide which would be applicable to your company. Thank you for listening.